For roughly 500 years, every physician trained in Europe learned medicine from a single book. From the lecture halls of Montpellier to the anatomy theatres of Padua, from Bologna to Louvain, one text stood above all others as the foundation of medical education. It was not written by a Greek. It was not written by a Roman. It was composed in Arabic in the early 11th century by a man the Latin West came to know as Avicenna. His real name was Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdallah ibn Sina, and his Canon of Medicine remained the primary medical textbook in European universities, longer than any comparable work in the history of science. Generations of doctors who never read a word of Arabic, who never set foot outside of Christendom, who knew nothing of the Islamic intellectual tradition, nonetheless practiced medicine according to principles that this one man had laid down. His system for classifying disease, his rules for testing the effectiveness of drugs, his insistence that the body operates according to rational laws that can be understood and applied, these ideas did not merely influence European medicine, they governed it, and yet the man behind this extraordinary authority spent much of his life running, not from obscurity, but from the very real prospect of imprisonment, political execution, or forced servitude to rulers he refused to obey. He served as a court physician, a government minister, and a political prisoner. He crossed deserts, fled armies, and composed treatises from memory while locked in a fortress cell. He wrote the most comprehensive medical text in human history, not from the comfort of a great library or a well-funded institution, but in stolen hours between crises, in borrowed rooms, in cities he knew he would soon be forced to leave. The question at the centre of this story is not simply how one mind could contain so much knowledge. It is how a man with no permanent home, no lasting patron, and no institutional protection produced a body of work that outlasted every empire, every dynasty, and every court that either sheltered him or drove him away. How does a fugitive build something that endures for 1,000 years? That question takes us far from the European universities where his book would reign. It begins in a part of the world that most accounts of Western intellectual history barely mention, the fertile, cultured, and dangerously unstable heart of Central Asia, at the close of the 10th century, in a civilization that was itself on the edge of collapse. If you're finding this journey through history meaningful, a like helps this channel bring more stories out of the shadows. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Before there was a physician, before there was a philosopher, before there was a name that would echo through centuries of medical practice, in languages its owner never spoke, there was a place. A city of scholars and merchants, of poets and astronomers, rising from the flat, sun-scorched plains of what is now Uzbekistan. A city that for a brief, brilliant period housed one of the greatest libraries on earth. A city whose dynasty was already beginning to crack when, in the year 980, a child was born in a small village just outside its walls. The city was Bukhara, the dynasty was the Samanids, and the child would grow up to reshape how humanity understood the human body, the nature of existence, and the structure of knowledge itself, all before the world he was born in to finish tearing itself apart. The Samanid Empire, at the height of its power, stretched across a vast sweep of Central Asia and eastern Iran. Its capital, Bukhara, was not merely an administrative centre. It was one of the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world, a city that rivaled Baghdad in the depth and range of its scholarly life. The Samanid rulers, ethnic Persians governing under the broader authority of the Abbasid Caliphate, had made a deliberate choice to invest in knowledge. They funded translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic. They attracted mathematicians, astronomers, poets, and physicians to their court, and they assembled a royal library that was, by the accounts of those who saw it, extraordinary, not just in its size, but in the rarity of its holdings. Books existed within those walls that could be found nowhere else in the known world. This was the environment into which Ibn Sina was born. His father, Abdallah, was a man of some standing, a government administrator posted to the village of Afshana near Bukhara, where he managed local affairs on behalf of the Samanid state. Abdallah was educated, curious, and drawn to ideas that sat outside the mainstream of Sunni orthodoxy. He had become involved with Ismaili intellectual circles, a branch of Shia Islam known for its emphasis on esoteric knowledge and philosophical reasoning. In the tolerant atmosphere of the Samanid court, such affiliations were not immediately dangerous, but tolerance, in this part of the world, was a product of stability, and stability was beginning to erode. To the north, and Turkic tribal confederations were pressing against the empire's borders with increasing confidence. Internally, provincial governors tested the limits of their loyalty. The Samanid military, once formidable, was overstretched and increasingly dependent on Turkic slave soldiers whose allegiance was transactional. The golden age of Bukhara was real, but it rested on a foundation that was already shifting. The library still stood, the scholars still gathered, the court still patronized the arts, yet anyone paying attention could see the fractures spreading through the walls. Abdallah brought his young family to Bukhara itself when the boy was still small, ensuring access to the city's educational resources. He hired private tutors. He exposed his son to the philosophical discussions that took place in his own home, where Ismaili scholars debated questions of cosmology, the nature of the divine, and the structure of the soul. The child absorbed it all, not passively, but with an intensity that unsettled even the men who were teaching him. Into this world of accumulated brilliance and gathering instability, in the year 980, a child was born. Within a decade he would exhaust every teacher Bukhara had to offer. Ibn Sina's early education followed the standard path for a gifted child in a prosperous Muslim household. He began with the Quran. By the age of 10, he had committed the entire text to memory, an accomplishment that, while remarkable, was not unheard of among dedicated students of his era. What set him apart was not the memorization itself, but what came after. Having absorbed the foundational text of his civilization, the boy turned to everything else with the same ferocity. His father arranged a series of tutors. A scholar of Islamic jurisprudence came to teach him law. A specialist in Indian arithmetic introduced him to mathematics. A vegetable seller in the Bukhara market, a man named Ismail al-Zahid, who was also a respected scholar of philosophy, was enlisted to guide the boy through logic and the basic works of Greek thought. Just one by one, Ibn Sina moved through these teachers, not gradually, but with a speed that left each of them behind. Al-Zahid, the market philosopher, taught him what he could, and then had nothing more to offer. The mathematics tutor reached the same point. By his early teens, the boy was studying independently, working through texts without guidance, pulling volumes from wherever he could find them. Then he hit a wall. The text was Aristotle's Metaphysics, the dense, foundational work on the nature of being, causation, and the structure of reality. Ibn Sina read it. He read it again. By his own later account, he read it 40 times, until the words were fixed in his memory and the arguments could be recited without error. And still he did not understand it. The meaning eluded him. The logical structure that was supposed to hold the work together refused to cohere in his mind. For a young man who had mastered every subject placed before him, this was something new, not difficulty, but genuine incomprehension, the experience of confronting a work that seemed to operate by rules he had not yet learned. The breakthrough came by accident. Walking through a Bihara market, he encountered a bookseller pressing a small volume on him, eager to make a sale. The book was a commentary on the metaphysics by a philosopher named Abu Nasr al-Farabi, a Central Asian thinker who had died decades earlier. Ibn Sina bought it for a trivial price, carried it home, and began to read. The effect was immediate. Al-Farabi had not merely summarized Aristotle, he had reorganized the argument, clarified its internal logic, and connected it to a broader framework that made the purpose of each section visible for the first time. In Ibn Sina's own words, The text he'd read 40 times without understanding suddenly opened to him. The metaphysics did not contain new information. Al-Farabi's commentary had given him the method to extract what was already there. This was more than a moment of academic progress. It was a transformation in how Ibn Sina approached knowledge itself. Understanding was not simply a matter of absorbing content. It required a structural framework, a system for organizing ideas so that their relationships became visible. A cheap book from a market stall had taught him something that years of tutoring had not. The metaphysics had resisted him for months. Philosophy had a lock he could not pick. It took a dead man's commentary, found by accident, to open it. And once it opened, Ibn Sina would never approach knowledge the same way again. While philosophy had demanded a struggle, medicine came to Ibn Sina with an ease that he himself found almost unsettling. He began studying medical texts in his mid-teens, working through the Arabic translations of Galen and Hippocrates, the clinical writings of Al-Razi, and the pharmacological catalogues available in Bukhara's collections. He later wrote that medicine was not a difficult science, a statement that reveals less about the simplicity of the subject than about the extraordinary speed with which his mind processed systematic knowledge. Where the metaphysics had required 40 readings and an external key, medicine yielded its logic on first contact. The body to him was a system. Systems could be understood. He did not simply study from books. He began treating patients while still a teenager, on seeking out the sick in Bukhara and offering his services, partly from genuine concern, partly from the conviction that medical knowledge without clinical practice was incomplete. Theory alone could describe disease. Only observation could confirm whether the description was accurate. This dual commitment to logical structure and to direct experience would later become the defining feature of his medical writing. Then came the event that changed the trajectory of his life. The Samanid Sultan, Nuh ibn Mansur, fell ill with a condition that his court physicians could not resolve. The specific nature of the ailment is debated by historians. Some sources suggest a digestive disorder, others a more systemic complaint. But the outcome is not in doubt. The established doctors of the court failed. All word reached them of a young man in the city who had been producing remarkable results with his patients. Ibn Sina was summoned. He was approximately 16 years old. He examined the Sultan. He prescribed a course of treatment. The Sultan recovered, and in gratitude Nuh ibn Mansur granted the young physician a reward that was worth more than any sum of gold: access to the royal library of Bukhara. Ibn Sina entered those rooms and found himself surrounded by knowledge he'd not known existed. The collection was organized by subject: one room for law and jurisprudence, another for poetry and literature, another for philosophy, another for the natural sciences. He later recalled finding texts there that most scholars had never even heard of, works that existed in no other collection, and manuscripts whose authors had been forgotten by the wider world. For a mind that had already consumed everything Bukhara's tutors and markets could provide, this was a new horizon, an intellectual landscape that extended further than he had imagined possible. He read systematically, moving through the collection with the same intensity he had brought to every earlier subject. He took notes, he cross-referenced, he identified connections between disciplines that their authors had not seen. The library became in effect his university, the only institution of higher learning he would ever attend, and one to which he was admitted not through examination or family connection, but through the single act of healing a king. This is the detail that reshapes the conventional portrait of Ibn Sina as the greatest physician of the medieval world. Medicine was not his destination, it was his key. The act of curing the Sultan was not the culmination of his ambitions, but the beginning of them. The real prize was not the gratitude of a ruler, but the door it opened. A door into a room full of books that would feed every branch of his thought for the rest of his life. He had been given the keys to one of the greatest collections of knowledge in the known world. He would have only a few years to absorb it before it was destroyed. The Samanid dynasty did not collapse all at once. It crumbled in stages, each one stripping away another layer of the stability that had made Bukhara's intellectual life possible. Through the 990s, the Karakhanid Turks pushed deeper into Samanid territory from the north. Provincial governors declared independence or switched allegiance. The slave soldiers who formed the backbone of the Samanid military began calculating which side offered them a better future. Nu ibn Mansur, the sultan who had opened the library to Ibn Sina, saw his authority contract year by year, reduced from sovereign command to a series of desperate negotiations with men who no longer feared him. Sometime during this period of disintegration, the precise date remains uncertain, the royal library of Bukhara was damaged or destroyed. Some sources describe a fire. Others suggest it was ransacked during the political chaos that accompanied the dynasty's final years. What is certain is that the collection, the irreplaceable accumulation of centuries of scholarship, was lost. Books that existed in no other copy vanished. Entire branches of knowledge that had been preserved only within those walls disappeared from the human record. And then a strange accusation surfaced. Rivals of Ibn Sina, men who envied his access and his growing reputation, claimed that he had set the fire himself. The charge was almost certainly baseless. There is no credible evidence to support it, and the political upheaval of the period provides a far more plausible explanation for the library's destruction. But the accusation is revealing in its own right, and his contemporaries found it believable that a man of such intellectual appetite might want to destroy what he had already consumed, ensuring that no other mind could benefit from the same sources. They saw in him not merely a scholar, but a kind of intellectual predator, someone whose hunger for knowledge was so total that it could, in their imagining, turn destructive. Whether or not Ibn Sina internalized the loss of the library as a personal catastrophe, the practical consequences were immediate. The institution that had served as his only true school was gone. Whatever he had absorbed during his years of access, the notes he had taken, the connections he had drawn, the frameworks he had built in his own mind, was now all that remained of those vanished texts. From this point forward, he would work primarily from internal resources, reconstructing and extending what the library had given him through the power of memory and synthesis alone. The collapse of the Samanids brought a second, more intimate loss. Around this same period, Ibn Sina's father Abdallah died, the man who had arranged his education, who had brought Ismaili scholars into the family home, who had moved the family to Bukhara to give his son access to its resources. He was gone, and with him went the family's remaining social and political standing. Abdallah's Ismaili connections, once tolerated under a stable dynasty, now offered no protection in a landscape where power was being seized by men with no interest in philosophical subtlety. At roughly 18 years of age, Ibn Sina found himself without a library, without a father, without a patron, and without a state. The empire that had nurtured him was gone. The library that had fed him was ash. His father was in the ground. And Ibn Sina walked out of Bukhara with nothing but what he carried in his mind. The years that followed the fall of Bukhara established the pattern that would define the rest of Ibn Sina's life. He moved from city to city across the fragmented landscape of Central Asia and Iran, seeking the one thing no amount of personal brilliance could replace, a patron willing to provide stability long enough for serious work to be done. His first significant stop was Gurganj, the capital of the Khwarezm region south of the Aral Sea. The Khwarezm Shah, the local ruler, maintained a modest but genuine court of scholars, and Ibn Sina found temporary welcome there. It was in Gurganj that he encountered one of the few intellects of his era who could meet him on equal ground, Abu Rayhan al-Biruni. Al-Biruni was a polymath of staggering range, a mathematician, astronomer, historian, and natural philosopher. He approached the physical world with a precision and skepticism that set him apart from most of his contemporaries. Where Ibn Sina built grand philosophical systems from first principles, al-Biruni preferred to measure, observe, and withhold judgment until the evidence was sufficient. Their exchange took the form of a series of written questions and responses, a formal intellectual debate conducted through letters that have survived to this day. Al-Biruni challenged Ibn Sina on points of Aristotelian physics, questioning whether certain accepted principles held up under empirical scrutiny. Ibn Sina responded with elaborate defences rooted in logical argument. The correspondence was respectful but sharp, each man pushing the other toward the limits of his own method. They were not enemies, but they were not allies either. Two different architectures of thought, housed in the same generation and the same region, each suspicious of the other's foundations. The encounter was brief. The broader political situation was deteriorating, and a new power was making its presence felt with unmistakable force. Mahmud of Ghazni, the Sultan of the Ghaznavid Empire based in what is now eastern Afghanistan, was expanding his domain with aggressive ambition. Mahmud was a conqueror, a patron of specific forms of learning, and a man who viewed the collection of scholars the way other rulers viewed the collection of territory, as a measure of prestige and a tool of legitimacy. He sent word to the court at Gurgunj demanding that its most distinguished intellectuals be dispatched to his own capital. Al-Biruni accepted the summons. He would spend the rest of his career at the Ghaznavid court, producing some of his greatest work under Mahmud's patronage, including his masterwork on Indian civilization. Ibn Sina refused. The reasons were likely both personal and political. Mahmud was known for his rigid Sunni orthodoxy and his hostility toward Shia and Ismaili thought, the very intellectual tradition in which Ibn Sina had been raised. To enter Mahmud's court was to place himself under the authority of a ruler who might tolerate his medical skill but would never accept his philosophical independence. Ibn Sina understood that patronage on those terms was not support, it was captivity. The refusal carried consequences. Mahmud of Ghazni was not a man who accepted defiance, and he had painters create physical portraits of the scholars who had rejected his summons and distributed these likenesses to agents and border officials across the region. Ibn Sina was now a wanted man, pursued not for any crime, but for the act of choosing where to direct his own mind. Ibn Sina left Gurgunj under cover, moving quickly and with a small group of companions. The route he chose was not the safest. It was the one least likely to be watched. He crossed the Karakum Desert, a vast waterless expanse in present-day Turkmenistan, one of the most inhospitable stretches of terrain in Central Asia. Sand, heat, the absence of shade or shelter for miles in every direction. Whatever provisions they carried had to last between distant oases, and the margin for error was measured not in days but in hours. The journey was not a dramatic sprint. It was an endurance test, slow, grinding, and defined by the constant calculation of whether enough water remained to reach the next point of resupply. For a man who had spent his formative years in libraries and at court, the desert offered no intellectual stimulation, no philosophical conversation, no access to texts. There was only the physical reality of survival, cracked lips, burning feet, the weight of a pack on shoulders that had been built for a writing desk, not a caravan. And yet, according to accounts that would later be recorded by his closest companion, Ibn Sina continued to compose during the crossing. Not with pen and paper, those were luxuries the desert did not afford consistently, but through dictation and mental drafting. He worked through philosophical arguments in his head, constructing the logical scaffolding of treatises he would write down once he had a surface to write on. The desert could deprive him of every physical resource. It could not stop the process of thought. The mind that had memorized the Quran at 10 and read the metaphysics 40 times was not dependent on external tools. It had become its own archive. The crossing brought him, eventually, through a succession of small towns in the province of Khorasan, Nassa, Bawad, Tus, and others whose names appear briefly in the biographical sources before being left behind. At each stop, Ibn Sina offered his medical services in exchange for temporary shelter and provisions. At each stop, he assessed whether the local ruler could offer anything more lasting. At each stop, the answer was no. The courts were too small, too poor, or too politically fragile to shelter a man with a price on his reputation. He was heading, with the slow determination of a man running out of options, toward the southeastern shore of the Caspian Sea, toward a city called Jurjan, where a minor but independent court offered the possibility, however slight, of a patron willing to look past the political risks of harbouring a scholar that Mahmud of Ghazni wanted for himself. When he finally reached Jurjan, diminished by the journey and unrecognisable from the months of deprivation, he found someone waiting for him, a young man who had travelled to meet the philosopher, whose reputation had somehow outrun even a fugitive. His name was Abu Ubaid al-Juzjani, and he had come to Jurjan with a single purpose: to study under the man whose writings on logic and philosophy had already begun circulating in the region. Al-Juzjani was not a prodigy. He was not a rival intellect. He was something far rarer, and as it turned out, far more important to the survival of Ibn Sina's legacy, a devoted student with an instinct for preservation. Their meeting, around the year 1012, marked the beginning of the most consequential intellectual partnership of the medieval Islamic world. Al-Juzjani would remain at Ibn Sina's side for the next quarter century, through every court and every crisis, until the philosopher's death. He served simultaneously as student, secretary, copyist, editor, and personal witness. And it is through his records, part biography, part memoir, part meticulous log of intellectual output, that the vast majority of what we know about Ibn Sina's working methods, daily habits, and personal character has survived. Al-Juzjani's account reveals a man whose relationship with work bordered on the compulsive. Ibn Sina's routine, once he had the minimal conditions to sustain it, followed a pattern that he maintained for decades. He wrote and studied deep into the night, sometimes until the early hours of the morning. He slept briefly. He rose and resumed. When travelling between cities, which, given his circumstances, was often, he composed in his head, dictating to Al-Juzjani when materials were available, holding the structures in memory when they were not. He drank wine, openly and without apology, a habit that scandalized some of his more orthodox contemporaries and provided his critics with easy ammunition. He regarded the wine not as indulgence, but as a practical tool, a means of sustaining focus during extended periods of mental exertion. Whether this was genuine self-knowledge or sophisticated rationalization, Al-Juzjani recorded it without comment. What emerges from these records is not the serene image of a philosopher at peace with a contemplative life. It is the portrait of a man in a permanent state of intellectual urgency, someone who worked as though he knew the window of opportunity could close at any moment. Given the pattern of his life to this point, that sense of urgency was not paranoia, it was experience. Every period of stability he had known, the Samanid court, the Bukhara library, the brief shelter at Gurganj, had ended abruptly and without warning. The lesson was clear. If the work was going to get done, it had to get done now, because there was no guarantee that the conditions for doing it would exist tomorrow. Al-Juzjani understood this. He organized his own life around the philosopher's rhythms, staying awake when Ibn Sina stayed awake, copying what was dictated, cataloguing what was finished, and, crucially, preserving drafts and fragments that Ibn Sina himself might have abandoned or lost in the next displacement. Al-Juzjani had found his teacher. Now they needed a court willing to shelter both of them, and in a region carved up by warlords and sultans, that shelter would never remain permanent. It was during the period following his arrival in Jurjan, likely beginning around 1012 to 1014, as he moved between Jurjan and other cities in the region, that Ibn Sina began composing the work that would, more than anything else he created, determine his place in history. He called it Al-Canon fil-Tib, the Canon of Medicine. To understand what the canon was, it is necessary first to understand what it was not. It was not a book of remedies. It was not a compilation of case studies. It was not a manual for practicing physicians in the way that earlier medical texts had been. Collections of accumulated wisdom, Organised loosely by topic, drawn from personal experience and inherited tradition, Ibn Sina was not interested in producing another addition to that genre. He intended to do something that no one had attempted before, to organise the entirety of medical knowledge into a single logically coherent system, structured not by the habits of clinical practice, but by the principles of philosophical demonstration. The key insight that drove the project was the one he had absorbed from Al-Farabi's commentary years earlier. Knowledge does not become useful simply because it is accumulated. It becomes useful when it is organised, when the relationships between its parts are made visible, when the principles that govern individual observations are identified and stated explicitly, when the learner can move from general rules to specific applications through a chain of reasoning rather than a leap of memory. This was what Al-Farabi had done for Aristotle's metaphysics. Ibn Sina would now do it for the entire field of medicine. He divided the canon into 5 books, each addressing a distinct domain. The first laid out general medical principles, the nature of the human body, the causes of health and disease, the elements and humours, and the rules for maintaining well-being. The second catalogued simple drugs, individual medicinal substances, each described by its properties, its effects, and the conditions under which it should and should not be used. The third addressed diseases organised by organ, moving systematically through the body from head to foot, describing the conditions that could afflict each part and the treatments appropriate to each. The fourth dealt with conditions that were not specific to a single organ, but affected the body as a whole: fevers, swellings, wounds, poisons, and some conditions requiring surgical intervention. The fifth and final book was a formulary, a catalogue of compound medications, describing how to combine simple drugs into complex remedies and specifying the dosages and methods of preparation. No previous medical text had attempted this scope with this degree of internal organisation. Galen had been prolific, but his writings were scattered across dozens of individual works, each addressing a specific topic, with no overarching structure connecting them. Al-Razi, the great Persian physician of the previous century, had compiled an enormous medical encyclopedia, but it was organised as a reference collection, comprehensive in content but lacking the logical spine that would allow a student to learn medicine as a system rather than a catalogue. Ibn Sina's ambition was different in kind. He wanted to build a framework in which every medical fact had a defined position, every treatment could be derived from stated principles, and every observation could be tested against the rules that governed it. He had begun the most ambitious medical project in history. It would take him more than a decade to finish, not because the ideas were slow in coming, but because the world around him would not hold still long enough to let him write. The canon's ambition was architectural. Its genius was in the details. Consider the problem of testing whether a drug actually works. Before Ibn Sina, the standard approach was essentially anecdotal. A physician tried a remedy, observed the result, and recorded the outcome. If enough physicians reported the same result, the remedy was accepted as effective. The weakness of this approach was obvious even by medieval standards, but no one had proposed a systematic alternative. Ibn Sina did. In the canon's first book, he laid out a set of rules for evaluating the effectiveness of any medicinal substance, conditions that had to be met before a drug could be considered reliably proven. The drug had to be tested in its pure form, unmixed with other substances, so that the observed effect could be attributed to it alone. It had to be tested against more than one type of the disease in question, to rule out the possibility that the result was specific to a single case. The effect had to be observed consistently. A drug that worked once and failed 3 times was not proven. The timing of the effect had to correspond to what the drug's properties predicted, and the testing had to be conducted on human patients, not only on animals, because the response of a human body could differ from that of other creatures. These principles did not constitute a clinical trial in the modern sense. They lack the controls, the randomization, and the statistical analysis that define contemporary experimental medicine, but they represented a radical departure from what came before, a formal, explicit methodology for distinguishing effective treatments from inherited assumptions. No previous medical text had articulated such standards. The canon's pharmacological scope was equally unprecedented. The second book catalogued over 760 individual medicinal substances, minerals, plants, and animal-derived products, each described with its observed physical properties, its temperamental classification within the humoral system, the conditions for which it was prescribed, and its potential dangers. This was not a list. It was a database, organized by a consistent internal logic that allowed a physician to reason about unfamiliar drugs by analogy with known ones. In the third book, Ibn Sina's clinical observations reached a level of specificity that repeatedly anticipated later discoveries. He described the anatomy of the eye with a precision that corrected errors in Galen's account, errors that had gone unchallenged for 800 years. He distinguished between mediastinitis, an inflammation of the tissue separating the lungs, and pleurisy, an inflammation of the membrane surrounding them, a diagnostic distinction that required careful attention to symptom patterns and that remained clinically relevant into the modern period. He recognized that certain diseases could be transmitted through contaminated water and through what he described as minute bodies too small to be seen, an observation that, while framed within the humoral system rather than germ theory, nonetheless pointed toward a mechanism of contagion that would not be scientifically confirmed until the 19th century. Perhaps most remarkably, Ibn Sina devoted sustained attention to the relationship between emotional states and physical illness. He described cases in which persistent grief, anxiety, or lovesickness produced measurable physiological symptoms, changes in pulse, disruptions to digestion, deterioration of overall health. He treated these conditions not as moral failings or spiritual afflictions, but as medical phenomena with identifiable causes and potential treatments. In one frequently cited case, he diagnosed a young man's mysterious wasting illness by monitoring his pulse while reciting the names of different neighborhoods and households, identifying the specific person whose mention caused the pulse to spike, a diagnostic technique that combined clinical observation with psychological insight in a way that would not be systematically revisited until the development of psychosomatic medicine in the 20th century. Each of these contributions was embedded within the canon's larger argument that the body operates according to rational principles, that these principles can be discovered through disciplined observation and logical analysis, and that medicine, practiced correctly, is not a craft of intuition but a branch of natural philosophy. The canon was assembling a vision of medicine the world had never seen, yet the physician building it could not heal the one condition that threatened him most, a political landscape that granted no scholar safety for long. Through the 10 teens, Ibn Sina's path traced a westward arc across northern Iran, drawn by the fragmentary Buyid dynasty, a Shia Persian family whose various branches controlled different cities with varying degrees of competence and stability. Each court offered a version of the same bargain: medical service in exchange for protection and the space to work. Each court sooner or later revealed the limits of that bargain. At Ray, near present-day Tehran, Ibn Sina entered the service of a Buyid prince and found a court consumed by faction. The ruler was young, his advisors divided, and the political atmosphere was one of constant manoeuvring. Ibn Sina treated patients, produced treatises, and watched the familiar pattern reassert itself, promising beginning, deteriorating conditions, inevitable departure. He moved on before the situation collapsed entirely. Hamadan, further west in the Zagros Mountains, offered something different. The Buyid emir there, Shams al-Dawla, was a military man, direct, pragmatic, and suffering from a severe and recurrent intestinal condition that his court physicians could not manage. Ibn Sina succeeded where they had failed, bringing the emir reliable relief. Gratitude, in this case, took an extraordinary form. Shams al-Dawla did not simply retain Ibn Sina as a physician, he appointed him vizier, the chief political administrator of the state. The appointment was, on its surface, a remarkable elevation. A wandering scholar, a man who had arrived with nothing but his reputation and his companion, was now the second most powerful figure in an independent principality. He had a residence, he had an income. He had, for the first time in years, the material conditions to pursue his intellectual work without the constant anxiety of displacement. The reality was more complicated. The Vizierate placed Ibn Sina at the centre of military and administrative decisions for which his education had not prepared him and in which he had no natural allies. The soldiers who formed the backbone of Shams al-Dawla's power did not answer to a physician. They answered to commanders whose authority was earned on the battlefield, and they viewed the sudden elevation of a foreign scholar with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. Among the court's existing political class, the administrators, tax collectors, and provincial officials whose positions depended on established hierarchies, the arrival of an outsider at the apex of power was an implicit threat, and Ibn Sina governed by day and wrote by night. Al-Juzjani recorded sessions in which the philosopher, after spending the daylight hours adjudicating disputes and managing the business of the state, would gather his students in the evening and work through the Canon and the Shifa by lamplight, dictating passages while others took notes. The pace was extraordinary, and it was sustained not by a supportive institutional structure, but by the sheer force of will of a man who understood that political favour was a wasting asset. The philosopher had become a minister of state. He governed by day and wrote the canon by night. But the soldiers who served under the emir had no loyalty to a scholar in a politician's robes, and they were about to make that very clear. Even as the political pressures of the vizierate mounted, Ibn Sina was constructing a second monument, one that, in pure intellectual ambition, surpassed even the canon. He called it Kitab al-Shifa, the Book of Healing. The name was misleading by design. This was not a medical text. It was an attempt to heal a different kind of deficiency, the fragmentation of human knowledge itself. The Shifa was an encyclopedia of philosophy in the original Aristotelian sense of the word, a comprehensive treatment of everything that could be known through reason. It was divided into 4 major parts: logic, natural science, mathematics, and metaphysics. Each part contained multiple books. The logic section alone comprised 9 volumes, uncovering not only Aristotle's original logical works, but extending and refining them in ways that no previous philosopher in any tradition had attempted. The natural science section addressed physics, psychology, botany, zoology, and the principles governing change and motion in the physical world. The mathematics section covered geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. And the metaphysics, the crown of the work, presented Ibn Sina's mature account of the nature of existence, causation, the soul, and the divine. No single thinker since Aristotle himself had attempted a work of this scope, and unlike Aristotle, whose writings had been compiled and organized by later editors, often without clear systematic structure, Ibn Sina designed the Shifa from the outset as an integrated whole, each section building on what came before, each discipline occupying a defined position within a larger architecture of knowledge. It was in the Shifa's section on the soul, to the Kitab al-Nafs, that Ibn Sina introduced what would become his most famous and most debated philosophical argument. He called it the flying man. The thought experiment is deceptively simple. Imagine a person created fully formed, suspended in empty space, with no contact with any physical surface. Their eyes are covered. Their limbs are spread so that no part of their body touches any other part. They have no sensory input of any kind. No sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch. The question is, would this person be aware of their own existence? Ibn Sina's answer was yes. even stripped of every possible sensory experience, even deprived of any awareness of their own physical body, we, a conscious being, would still know that it exists. The self, therefore, cannot be identical with the body. Self-awareness is not a product of sensation. It is something more fundamental, an immediate, unmediated knowledge that does not depend on any physical process. The implications of this argument radiated outward in multiple directions. Within Islamic philosophy, it provided a powerful case for the immateriality, and therefore the immortality of the soul, a position with profound theological consequences. Within the broader history of philosophy, it anticipated by more than 600 years the argument that would make René Descartes famous. When Descartes sat in his room in the winter of 1641 and arrived at the conclusion that the one thing he could not doubt was the fact of his own thinking, cogito ergo sum, necessaski do, I think therefore I am. He was walking a path that Ibn Sina had already cleared. Whether Descartes knew this, whether he had encountered the argument through Latin translations of the Shifa that had circulated in European universities for centuries, remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is not debatable is that the structure of the argument, the move from radical doubt to the certainty of self-awareness, was articulated in the Shifa long before it appeared in the Meditations. He was building two monuments simultaneously, one for the body, one for the mind. Both required years of uninterrupted concentration, and in Hamadan, interruption was about to arrive at his door, armed and hostile. The soldiers of Hamadan had endured the appointment of a physician to the highest administrative office in their state, with a resentment that grew more volatile by the week. Ibn Sina had no military background, no tribal connections, no history of shared hardship with the men whose loyalty the state depended on. To them, he was an outsider who had been elevated above warriors through the accident of a sultan's stomach ailment. The grievance was not merely personal, it was structural, a philosopher sitting in a chair that soldiers believed belonged to one of their own. The breaking point came without elaborate planning. A faction within the military garrison decided to act. They surrounded Ibn Sina's residence, forced their way inside, and seized him. Al-Juzjani's account describes the scene with the spare precision of a man who had witnessed it firsthand. The armed men, the confiscation of property, the demands for his removal, and the explicit threat of execution. The soldiers wanted him gone. Some of them wanted him gone permanently. What saved him was the same skill that had put him in danger. Shams al-Dawla, the Amir, suffered from his chronic intestinal condition with a severity that no other physician in the court could manage. Executing Ibn Sina would mean losing the one man who could reliably treat the ruler's illness. The soldiers could threaten a vizier. They could not afford to lose a doctor. It was a grim calculation. His life was spared not because anyone valued his philosophical work or his administrative service, but because his medical skill made him too practically useful to destroy. The compromise that followed was as humiliating as it was predictable. Ibn Sina was stripped of the vizierate. His property, already confiscated, was not returned. He was permitted to remain in Hamadan, but under drastically reduced circumstances. No political authority, no public role, no protection beyond the Amir's intermittent need for his medical care. He went into hiding. For approximately 40 days he sheltered in the home of a sympathetic associate named Abu Ghalib al-Attar, staying out of sight while the political situation stabilized. The soldiers had made their point. The philosopher had been put in his place. And in that place, a borrowed room in someone else's house with no library, no students, and no official standing, Ibn Sina continued to write. Al-Juzjani records that during this period of concealment, the philosopher worked on portions of both the Canon and the Shifa, producing new material under conditions that would have paralyzed most scholars into inactivity. The pattern that had emerged during the desert crossing held firm, deprive him of status, of safety, of resources, of everything except the contents of his own mind, and the work continued. It was not defiance, exactly. It was something closer to compulsion. the inability to stop building the intellectual structures that gave his life its architecture, regardless of whether the external world was cooperating. When the immediate danger passed, Shams al-Dawla restored Ibn Sina to the vizierate, briefly. The cycle was unstable, and Ibn Sina knew it. The emir's health was declining. When Shams al-Dawla eventually died, the soldiers offered the vizierate once more to the philosopher, perhaps recognizing that the incoming ruler might also need his medical care. This time, Ibn Sina declined. He had learned what the position cost, but he'd not given up on the possibility of a better patron. In secret, through carefully guarded channels, Ibn Sina had begun writing letters to another court entirely, to Ala al-Dawla, the Kakuyid ruler of Isfahan, a city to the south with a reputation for greater stability and a more genuine commitment to scholarly life. The correspondence was hidden from the Hamadan court. Discovery would mean more than the loss of a political post. He had survived. He had kept his pen moving even while the walls closed in. But Hamadan was no longer a refuge. It was a cage. And if the letters to Isfahan were intercepted, the consequences would extend far beyond exile. The letters were discovered. How exactly the Hamadan court intercepted Ibn Sina's correspondence with al-Dawla in Isfahan is unclear in the sources. What is clear is the interpretation placed on them. A court physician, a man who had already been stripped of the vizierate once and restored only reluctantly, had been secretly offering his services to a rival ruler. In the political vocabulary of 11th century Iran, this was not dissatisfaction. It was betrayal. The new emir of Hamadan, Sama al-Dawla, the son of the ruler Ibn Sina had served, ordered his arrest. Ibn Sina was seized and taken to the fortress of Fardajan, a stronghold perched in the rugged terrain outside Hamadan. The details of the imprisonment are sparse but consistent across the sources. He was confined. His movements were restricted. His access to the outside world was cut. The man who had spent his adult life moving from court to court, always one step ahead of political collapse, was now physically trapped, locked inside stone walls by the order of a ruler whose father he had kept alive. Al-Juzjani, who was not imprisoned with him, maintained contact through intermediaries. Through these fragile channels, fragments of information passed back and forth, practical concerns about the conditions of confinement, messages to associates, and, remarkably, intellectual work. Because what happened inside Fardajan is the detail that separates Ibn Sina's story from every other account of a persecuted scholar in the medieval world. He kept writing, without his library, without his reference texts, without the manuscripts of the Canon and the Shifa that represented years of accumulated labour, without Al-Juzjani to take dictation or organise drafts, without even at certain points reliable access to pen and paper. Ibn Sina composed from the interior, drawing on the vast structure of knowledge he had been building in his mind since the age of 10, since the memorization of the Quran, since the 40 readings of the metaphysics, since the years spent absorbing the royal library of Bukhara before it burned. Among the works attributed to this period is a philosophical allegory called Hay ibn Yaqzan, alive, son of awake, a narrative that imagined a solitary figure gaining knowledge of the divine through reason alone without the aid of society, teachers, or revelation. The choice of subject was pointed. A prisoner, or cut off from every external resource, demonstrating through the act of composition that the mind contains its own light. It was philosophy as autobiography, written by a man whose circumstances had made the thought experiment literal. He also reportedly continued work on portions of the Shifa, reconstructing arguments from memory in a sequence that Al-Juzjani would later verify against existing drafts. The accuracy of the reconstruction, the degree to which the prison compositions matched or extended the pre-imprisonment material, suggests a memory not merely retentive but architecturally organized. Ibn Sina did not simply remember facts. He remembered the structures that held facts in relation to one another. He could rebuild a philosophical system the way an architect could rebuild a cathedral from its blueprints, even if the blueprints existed only in his head. The imprisonment lasted approximately 4 months. 4 months in which the world outside Fardayan continued to shift, alliances forming and dissolving, military campaigns being launched and abandoned, the chess game of buoyed politics playing out without regard for the philosopher locked in one of its fortresses. 4 months in which Ibn Sina produced work that scholars would study for centuries. Locked in a fortress, stripped of his books, denied even the basic materials of a scholar's life, Ibn Sina wrote from the archive of his own memory. The prison could hold his body. It could not hold what he knew, but escape, when it came, would require something far more dangerous than philosophy. The opportunity came when the political situation in Hamadan shifted once more, a factional realignment that briefly loosened the attention of those responsible for keeping Ibn Sina confined. The details of the escape are recorded with a specificity that suggests al-Juzjani heard them directly from the philosopher himself. Ibn Sina left Fardajan disguised as a Sufi mystic. He wore the coarse wool robes of a wandering dervish. He adopted the mannerisms, the speech patterns, the unhurried gait of a man whose relationship with the world was spiritual rather than political. It was a performance, and it had to be convincing, because the roads out of Hamadan were not empty. Patrols, checkpoints, and the general atmosphere of suspicion that accompanied beard political instability meant that a recognized court physician travelling under his own identity would have been stopped before he reached the city walls. He was accompanied by al-Juzjani, his brother, and a small number of trusted companions. They travelled light, carrying what they could without attracting attention. The manuscripts that could be transported were bundled and concealed. Those that were too bulky or too conspicuous were left behind. A calculated loss that Ibn Sina accepted with the pragmatism of a man who had already survived the destruction of the Bukhara library. The journey south to Isfahan covered roughly 300 miles of mountainous terrain through the Zagros range, along routes that were well travelled but not secure, where every encounter with strangers carried risk. A Sufi mystic would be expected to behave in certain ways, to speak of God, to show indifference to worldly concerns, to accept hospitality with humility, and move on without urgency. Ibn Sina, a man whose every instinct was toward analysis, argument, and systematic inquiry, had to suppress the defining qualities of his mind in order to survive the journey. They arrived in Isfahan around the year 1024. Ibn Sina was approximately 44 years old. In the quarter century since he had walked out of Bukhara as an 18-year-old with nothing but the contents of his mind, he had served as a physician to sultans, held and lost political office, debated with one of the greatest scientists of his age, fled across a desert, composed the foundational structures of 2 monumental works, been imprisoned, written philosophy from memory in a cell, and escaped in the robes of a holy man. The serene portrait of the philosopher that later centuries would construct, the calm, bearded sage gazing into the distance on the covers of books and the faces of postage stamps, bore no resemblance to the reality of the life behind it. Ala al-Dawla, the Kakuyid ruler of Isfahan, received Ibn Sina with an enthusiasm that reflected both genuine intellectual admiration and political calculation. A philosopher of Ibn Sina's stature lent prestige to any court that sheltered him. The fact that he had defied Mahmud of Ghazni and survived the political turmoil of Hamadan only added to his reputation. Ala al-Dawla provided what no previous patron had managed to sustain: a residence, a regular income, access to scholarly resources, and a commitment to the philosopher's protection that would endure for more than a decade. For the first time in his adult life, Ibn Sina had something he had never been able to rely on. Not wealth, not status, not political power. Something far more valuable and far more rare in the world he inhabited. He had time. The Isfahan period produced an output that, even by Ibn Sina's standards, was extraordinary. Between roughly 1024 and 1037, a span of 13 years, he completed the Canon of Medicine, brought the Shifa to near completion, and generated dozens of additional works covering astronomy, linguistics, music theory, geology, and the classification of the sciences, the total body of writing attributed to this period alone would constitute a full career's achievement for most scholars. For Ibn Sina, it was the harvest of conditions he'd spent his entire adult life trying to secure. Al-Juzjani's records from this period provide the most detailed picture we have of the philosopher's working methods. The nightly sessions continued, Ibn Sina dictating while students copied, debating points of interpretation, revising earlier drafts in light of new arguments. The wine continued too, a feature of these sessions that Al-Juzjani notes without condemnation or apology. The philosopher's constitution, hardened by years of deprivation and travel, sustained a schedule that would have broken most men decades younger. He slept little. He ate modestly. He spent the reservoir of his physical energy with the same deliberate intensity that he spent his intellectual resources, completely and without evident concern for what would remain afterward. The canon received its final form during these years. The sections that had been drafted in Jurjan, revised in Hamadan, reconstructed from memory in Fadajan, all were integrated into the completed work. Al-Juzjani assisted in the final organisation, ensuring that the 5 books held together as the unified system Ibn Sina had envisioned from the beginning. The finished canon ran to approximately 1 million words, a staggering volume that nonetheless maintained the logical coherence of a work designed from its first page as an architecture rather than an accumulation. But Ibn Sina was not only a scholar during the Isfahan years, he also served al-Dawla in a practical capacity, functioning as the ruler's personal physician, and, at times, accompanying him on military campaigns. The philosopher rode with the army, providing medical care in field conditions, treating wounds, managing the ailments that inevitably spread through military encampments, and adapting the principles of the canon to the chaotic realities of wartime medicine. The image is jarring. The author of the most sophisticated medical text in the world crouched in a campaign tent, applying what he knew to men whose injuries bore no resemblance to the orderly disease classifications of his masterwork. But it was consistent with a conviction Ibn Sina had held since his teenage years in Bukhara, that medical knowledge without clinical application was incomplete. Theory had to meet the body, even if the body was lying on a battlefield. The pace, however, was exacting a price that the philosopher either could not see or chose to ignore. Al-Juzjani, who had spent more than a decade watching Ibn Sina's habits at close range, began to notice changes, a diminished resilience, a slower recovery from the exertions of travel, a vulnerability to illness that the younger Ibn Sina had simply powered through. The mind remained sharp. The body was sending different signals. He had finished the canon. He had advanced the Shifa toward completion. He had written more in a decade than most scholars produce in a lifetime. But Al-Juzjani noticed what the philosopher himself refused to acknowledge. The pace was consuming him from within. The Shifa's section on metaphysics contained an argument that would reverberate through both Islamic and Christian thought for centuries. It concerned the most fundamental question philosophy can ask. Why does anything exist at all? Ibn Sina began with an observation that seems almost self-evident once stated, but that no previous thinker had developed with such rigour. Everything we encounter in the world is, in principle, capable of either existing or not existing. A tree might exist, or it might not. A city might be founded, or it might never arise. Even a human life, any particular human life, is not something that had to happen. These things are what Ibn Sina called mumkin al-wujud, possible in their existence. They exist, but their existence is not guaranteed by their own nature. Something else had to bring them into being. This creates a problem. If every existing thing is merely possible, then every existing thing requires a cause, something outside itself that brought it into existence. But that cause, if it too is merely possible, also requires its own cause, and that cause requires another. The chain extends backward, and the question becomes whether it can extend backward forever. An infinite regression of causes, each one merely possible, each one dependent on something prior. Ibn Sina argued that it cannot. An infinite chain of merely possible things, each dependent on the one before it, can never explain why anything exists in the first place. The entire chain, no matter how long, remains contingent, hanging in logical space without a foundation. For the chain to have any ground at all, there must be something at its base that is not merely possible but necessary, something whose existence is guaranteed by its own nature, something that cannot not exist. This is what Ibn Sina called wajib al-wujud, the necessary existent. The necessary existent, by definition, has no cause. It has always existed. It cannot cease to exist. It is the source from which all merely possible things ultimately derive their being, and it must be one, because if there were two necessary existents, each would need some distinguishing feature, and that feature would imply a dependency, which would contradict the very concept of necessity. There is logically only one. Ibn Sina identified this necessary existent with God, but his God was not the personal interventionist deity of popular religious imagination. Here, the necessary existent of the Shifa was an abstract principle, pure being, pure intellect, the uncaused cause from which reality emanates through a chain of logical necessity rather than through discrete acts of will. God, in this framework, does not choose to create the world the way a craftsman chooses to build a table. The world flows from God's nature the way light flows from a flame, necessarily, eternally, and without deliberation. This had immediate theological consequences that Ibn Sina understood and accepted. If the world flows from God necessarily and eternally, then the world itself is eternal. It has no beginning in time. This contradicted the orthodox Islamic position that God created the world from nothing at a specific moment. Furthermore, if God's knowledge operates at the level of universal principles rather than individual particulars, then God knows that human beings exist and that they act according to certain patterns, but does not track the specific actions of specific individuals. This was a position that many theologians found indistinguishable from denying God's omniscience. Ibn Sina was aware that these conclusions placed him in dangerous territory. He was not attacking religion. He believed he was clarifying it, demonstrating that the deepest truths of theology could be reached through reason alone, without contradiction. But the theologians who would inherit his arguments did not share that confidence. Ibn Sina had constructed a proof for God that satisfied the philosopher. It would not satisfy the theologian. Within a generation of his death, one of Islam's most powerful minds would declare these ideas not merely wrong, but grounds for a charge far graver than intellectual error. The Isfahan years also gave Ibn Sina the opportunity to pursue interests that his peripatetic earlier life had never allowed him to develop fully. In astronomy, he conducted observations that went beyond the theoretical treatments found in the Shifa and engaged directly with the physical phenomena of the sky. His most notable astronomical contribution was his observation of Venus passing across the face of the Sun, what modern astronomy calls a transit of Venus. These events are rare, occurring in pairs separated by over a century, and they were almost never recorded in the medieval period. Ibn Sina not only observed the phenomenon, but drew a specific conclusion from it, that Venus must be closer to the Sun than the Earth is, because its passage across the solar disk demonstrated that it orbited between the two, and this was a conclusion based not on inherited cosmological theory, but on direct visual evidence, a distinction that mattered to Ibn Sina and that aligned with his broader commitment to grounding knowledge in observation. He also designed improvements to existing astronomical instruments, refining the tools used for measuring the positions and movements of celestial bodies. These were not theoretical proposals. Al-Juzjani records that Ibn Sina constructed some of these instruments himself or supervised their construction, testing them against known observations to verify their accuracy. The philosopher who had spent his career building systems of ideas was equally comfortable working with physical materials, grinding lenses, calibrating angles, checking results against what the sky actually showed. In physics, Ibn Sina addressed a question that had troubled natural philosophers since Aristotle. What keeps a projectile moving after it leaves the hand that threw it? Aristotle had proposed that the air displaced by the object rushed around behind it and pushed it forward, an explanation that even many of Aristotle's admirers found unsatisfying. Ibn Sina rejected it. He proposed instead that the act of throwing imparts to the object an internal force. He called it male, that sustains the object's motion until it is gradually overcome by resistance, and the natural tendency of heavy objects to fall. The moving body carries its own cause of motion within itself. This was a significant conceptual advance. The idea that a moving object possesses an internal impetus, distinct from any external push, they would be developed further by European natural philosophers in the 14th century under the name impetus theory. From there, the concept would evolve, through centuries of refinement, into the principle that Isaac Newton would formalize as inertia, the tendency of a body in motion to remain in motion unless acted upon by an external force. Ibn Sina's male was not inertia. It was conceived within a different physical framework and carried different assumptions about the nature of motion and rest, but it represented the crucial first step away from Aristotle's explanation and toward the physics of the modern world. In what would later be called chemistry, Ibn Sina took a position that was strikingly empirical for his era. He rejected the central claim of alchemy, that base metals could be transmuted into gold. Alchemists, he argued, could alter the superficial properties of substances, their colour, their texture, their apparent weight, but they could not change the fundamental nature of one metal into another. What appeared to be transmutation was, in reality, sophisticated imitation. The distinction he drew between changing how something looks and changing what something is reflected a deeper philosophical commitment to the idea that natural substances are fixed essences that resist artificial manipulation. He had reshaped medicine, redefined philosophy, and pushed against the limits of physics and astronomy. Yet the man who insisted that observation must govern theory was about to ignore every warning his own body was giving him. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was born in 1058, roughly 2 decades after Ibn Sina's death. He never met the philosopher. He never debated him in person, and yet he would become Ibn Sina's most consequential opponent, the man whose critique would fracture the philosopher's legacy along civilizational lines that persist to this day. Al-Ghazali was not a marginal figure. He was among the most respected Islamic theologians and jurists of his era, a professor at the prestigious Nizamiya Academy in Baghdad, and a man whose intellectual range rivaled that of the philosopher he set out to dismantle. He was also, crucially, a thinker who had immersed himself deeply in the philosophical tradition he intended to attack. Before writing his critique, al-Ghazali produced a meticulous summary of Ibn Sina's philosophical system, the Maqasid al-Falasiyat, or the aims of the philosophers, demonstrating that he understood the positions he was about to reject with a precision that none of the tradition's earlier critics had achieved. He was not dismissing philosophy from ignorance. He was prosecuting it from within. The attack came in a work titled Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Published around 1095, it targeted Ibn Sina by name on 20 specific philosophical positions, subjecting each to rigorous logical scrutiny. Al-Ghazali's method was surgical. He did not reject philosophy wholesale. He accepted its tools: logic, structured argumentation, the analysis of premises and conclusions. What he rejected were the specific conclusions that Ibn Sina had drawn using those tools, conclusions that al-Ghazali argued could not be sustained by the very logic that had produced them. 3 of the 20 charges carried a severity that went beyond academic disagreement. On these 3 points, al-Ghazali declared that Ibn Sina's positions constituted not merely philosophical error, but outright kufr, disbelief. The first was the eternity of the world. Ibn Sina's necessary existent argument implied that the world had no beginning in time, a direct contradiction of the Quranic account of creation. The second was the nature of God's knowledge. Ibn Sina's position that God knows universal principles but not individual particulars seemed to deny the omniscience that Islamic theology considered essential to the divine nature. Or the third was the denial of bodily resurrection. Ibn Sina had argued for the immortality of the soul, but had treated the physical resurrection of the body, a core tenet of Islamic eschatology, as a concession to popular understanding rather than a philosophical truth. Each of these charges, in certain legal frameworks, could carry the gravest possible consequences. Al-Ghazali was not merely arguing that Ibn Sina was wrong. He was arguing that anyone who followed these positions placed themselves outside the boundaries of the faith. It was an intellectual excommunication, conducted posthumously, against a man who could no longer respond. The impact was enormous, but it was not uniform. In the Sunni intellectual centres of the Eastern Islamic world, Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, Al-Ghazali's critique reinforced a growing suspicion of philosophy as an independent discipline. Philosophical inquiry did not disappear, but it was increasingly subordinated to theology, constrained by the requirement that its conclusions align with revealed truth. The space for the kind of free-ranging metaphysical speculation that Ibn Sina had practiced grew narrower, but in the Shia intellectual tradition, particularly in Iran, the response was different. Thinkers in the Ismaili and Twelver Shia traditions had long regarded Ibn Sina's philosophical method as compatible with their own theological commitments. Al-Ghazali's critique, rather than discrediting the philosopher, deepened the conviction among Shia scholars that his approach represented a legitimate path to divine knowledge. The Shifa continued to be studied, or taught, and extended in Iranian philosophical circles for centuries, a tradition that would eventually produce figures like Suhrawardi and Mulla Sadra, both of whom built their own systems on foundations that Ibn Sina had laid. And then there was the third destination, the one neither Ibn Sina nor Al-Ghazali could have anticipated. Al-Ghazali meant to bury philosophy. Instead, he redirected it. The ideas he condemned in Baghdad would find their warmest reception in Paris, Padua, and Oxford, carried there by translators who rendered Ibn Sina's Arabic into a Latin the philosopher himself never spoke. The condition announced itself with increasing severity through his mid-50s. A chronic intestinal disorder, colic in the terminology of his era, had troubled him intermittently for years, but by the early 1030s the episodes were growing longer, more intense and less responsive to treatment. The philosopher, who had catalogued over 760 drugs, who had laid out precise protocols for diagnosing and managing every category of internal disease, now found himself subject to the same brutal arithmetic that governed every patient he had ever treated. The body had its own logic, and that logic did not make exceptions for the man who had described it most completely. Ibn Sina treated himself. This was not unusual. Court physicians in the medieval Islamic world routinely managed their own health. No one alive had a more comprehensive command of available therapies. He prescribed himself a regimen that included celery seed-based preparations administered as enemas, a standard treatment for intestinal inflammation in the Canon's pharmacological framework. The treatment should have provided relief. It did not. According to al-Juzjani, something went wrong in the preparation. The account is careful but pointed. Al-Juzjani states that the assistants who compounded the remedy either erred in measuring one of the ingredients or deliberately added an excessive quantity of a harsh substance. The result was not healing, but further damage to an already compromised system. Whether the error was incompetence or sabotage, Al-Juzjani does not say with certainty, but he raises the possibility of deliberate harm, and the implication is clear. A man who had spent his life accumulating enemies, soldiers who had revolted against him, courtiers he had displaced, theologians who considered his ideas dangerous, was not without people who might welcome his decline. The question of sabotage cannot be resolved from the available evidence. What can be established is the consequence. Ibn Sina's condition worsened markedly after the failed treatment. The intestinal disorder became chronic and debilitating, leaving him weakened for days after each episode. His recovery times lengthened. The stamina that had carried him through desert crossings and prison cells and decades of nocturnal writing sessions was visibly diminishing. He responded to this new reality in the manner that had defined every crisis of his life. He continued working. Al-Juzjani records no change in the intellectual output during this period, no reduction in the hours devoted to composition and revision. The Shifa received further refinements. Additional treatises were drafted and dictated. The pace of the mind remained constant even as the body supporting it faltered. But there was a difference now. In previous crises, the fall of Bukhara, the desert crossing, the imprisonment at Fardajan, the threat had been external. Political collapse, military pursuit, the hostility of soldiers. These were dangers that could be fled, endured, or outlasted. The threat now was internal, seated in his own organs, progressing according to pathological mechanisms he understood better than any living person. He could not flee his own body. He could not outpace a disease that travelled with him. Nor Al-Juzjani watched the philosopher refuse to slow down and understood what the refusal meant. It was not courage exactly, though it took a certain kind of nerve. It was the recognition that time, the commodity Ibn Sina had spent his entire life trying to secure, was now genuinely finite. Whatever remained of the work had to be completed with whatever remained of the body. The man who had taught the world how to diagnose disease could feel his own systems failing. He had described this progression in his own canon, the stages of decline, the signs that indicated a condition had moved beyond the reach of remedy. He knew what was happening, and he knew there was no treatment in any book, including his, that could reverse it. Isfahan fell in 1034. The attacker was Masud of Ghazni, the son of Mahmud, the sultan whose summons Ibn Sina had refused more than 2 decades earlier in Gurganj. The Ghaznavid Empire had shifted its attention westward, and the Kakuyid state that had sheltered Ibn Sina for 13 years was too small and too isolated to resist the full weight of a major military power. Al-Dawlah's forces were defeated in the field. The Ghaznavid army entered the city. What followed was plunder. Isfahan was a wealthy city, and the conquering army treated it as a prize to be stripped. Homes were ransacked, markets were looted, government buildings were broken open and their contents seized or scattered. The violence was not targeted at any particular individual, it was the general. An indiscriminate destruction that accompanied any major sacking in the medieval world, the inevitable consequence of letting a victorious army feed on the spoils of a fallen city. But among the properties that were looted was the residence of Ibn Sina. The loss was catastrophic in a way that went beyond personal misfortune. The house contained manuscripts, drafts, revisions, completed works, and works in progress that represented years of intellectual labour. Some of these existed in no other copy. Al-Juzjani, meticulous as he was, had not been able to duplicate every text the philosopher produced. Certain works, treatises, annotations, preliminary drafts of arguments that had not yet been incorporated into the larger monuments were lost permanently. They passed out of the historical record during those hours of chaos. These are carried away by soldiers who had no idea what they held, or trampled underfoot or burned for warmth in a military camp. The specific titles and contents of what was lost can never be fully reconstructed. Some are known from references in other surviving works, Ibn Sina or Al-Juzjani mentioning a text that no subsequent scholar has ever been able to locate. Others are inferred from gaps in the existing body of work, arguments that seem incomplete, lines of inquiry that are introduced but never fully developed, sections of the Shifa that appear to gesture toward companion pieces that no longer exist. The canon and the core of the Shifa survived because copies had already been made and distributed, but the edges of his output, the smaller works, the experimental writings, The texts that existed in only a single draft were sheared away. There is a grim symmetry in the pattern. The Royal Library of Bukhara had burned when Ibn Sina was 18, destroying the accumulated knowledge of a civilization's golden age and leaving the young scholar with nothing but what his mind had absorbed. Now, more than 25 years later, his own library, the knowledge he himself had produced, was destroyed in turn by the descendants of the very power that had driven him from Bukhara in the first place. The Ghaznavids had pursued him across the geography of his life. The father's agents had searched for him with painted portraits. The son's army had found what remained of his work and scattered it without recognition. Idala al-Dawla rallied his forces and eventually regained a measure of control over his territories, but the security that Isfahan had represented was broken. Ibn Sina, weakened by illness and stripped of years of accumulated work, prepared to move once more. The son of the sultan he had once defied had taken his home, his manuscripts, and his safety. Ibn Sina was a fugitive again. Only now he was not a young man who could outrun a desert. He was aging, ill, and running out of places to go. Despite his condition, Ibn Sina accompanied Ala al-Dawla on a military campaign to reclaim the territory lost to the Ghaznavids. The decision to ride with the army was not heroic in any conventional sense. It was practical. Ala al-Dawla needed a physician. Ibn Sina had nowhere else to go. The relationship between philosopher and patron, which had begun with genuine mutual admiration, had calcified over the years into a simpler transaction: medical service in exchange for the protection that only a functioning state could provide. With Isfahan compromised, the army itself was the only institution still capable of offering that protection. The campaign moved through rough terrain. Al-Juzjani records that the travel conditions were harsh. Long marches, poor roads, exposure to the elements, and the unpredictable rhythms of a military force that made and broke camp according to tactical necessity rather than the needs of an ailing scholar. Ibn Sina's colic attacks intensified. The jarring movement of horseback travel aggravated his intestinal condition. His body, already weakened by the failed treatment and the stress of the Isfahan sacking, deteriorated with visible speed. He continued to treat himself. The preparations he administered grew more aggressive. Higher doses, stronger compounds, more frequent interventions. But each treatment seemed to push his body further from equilibrium rather than closer to it. The system he had spent his career describing, the delicate balance of humours and temperaments that sustained health, was collapsing in his own frame, and his attempts to restore it were accelerating the collapse. At some point during the campaign, according to Al-Juzjani's account, Ibn Sina stopped. The moment is recorded without drama. There was no grand pronouncement, no philosophical meditation on mortality delivered to an assembled audience. There was simply a decision, made privately, communicated to Al-Juzjani and perhaps a few others, that treatment was no longer serving its purpose. The physician who had managed his body, he reportedly said, had become incapable of the task. Further intervention was useless. This statement, if accurately preserved, is one of the most quietly devastating self-assessments in the history of medicine. This was not a patient accepting a doctor's verdict. This was the doctor, the greatest diagnostician of his age, delivering the verdict upon himself. He had read the signs. He had applied the principles of the canon to his own case with the same rigour he would have applied to any patient, and he had reached the conclusion that the canon itself prescribed for cases beyond remedy. The cessation of aggressive treatment and the acceptance of the body's trajectory. He did not stop working. Even after abandoning treatment, the intellectual process continued. Dictation, revision, the refinement of arguments whose significance would long outlast the body producing them. But there was a shift in register. The frantic urgency of the earlier years, the late nights, the relentless pace, the refusal to waste a single hour gave way to something steadier and more deliberate. He was no longer racing against political instability or the threat of displacement. He was working against a deadline that no patron could extend and no escape could outrun. He had stopped prescribing for himself. He had acknowledged what his own canon described as the point beyond remedy. The army marched on, and the philosopher rode with it, no longer as its healer, but as a man measuring his remaining days. In the final weeks, the process of composition narrowed to its most essential form. Ibn Sina could no longer sit upright for extended periods. He could no longer hold a pen with the steadiness that sustained writing required. The physical apparatus of scholarship, the desk, the inkwell, the careful hand shaping Arabic script across the page, had been reduced to a single remaining instrument: his voice. Al-Juzjani sat beside him and wrote. The subjects of these last sessions were not new. They were refinements, corrections to existing arguments in the Shifa, clarifications of positions that Ibn Sina felt had been stated with insufficient precision, adjustments to the logical scaffolding of proofs he had constructed decades earlier and revisited continuously since. There was no grand final work, thus no deathbed masterpiece composed in a burst of expiring energy. There was only the continuation of a process that had been running since his adolescence, the relentless drive to make the system more complete, more coherent, more resistant to the objections of future readers who would encounter his arguments long after he was gone. He also dictated shorter treatises during this period. Among them were reflections on the nature of the soul and its relationship to the body after dissolution, a subject that had occupied him philosophically since the flying man argument, and that now carried a personal immediacy no thought experiment could replicate. What happens to consciousness when the body it inhabits ceases to function? He had answered this question in the Shifa with the confidence of a metaphysician. He was now approaching it as a participant. Al-Juzjani's account of these sessions is restrained in a way that suggests he understood their historical weight. He does not editorialize. He does not describe the philosopher's emotional state or speculate about inner turmoil. He records what was dictated, notes the conditions under which it was produced, and marks the progression of the illness with the clinical detachment that Ibn Sina himself would have approved. The student had absorbed not just the teacher's ideas but his method, the commitment to accurate observation over interpretive embellishment. There is a quality to these final sessions that resists the usual narratives of decline, a life that had been defined by external disruption, the burning of libraries, the collapse of dynasties, the treachery of courts. Yet the pursuit of armies ended with a period of extraordinary internal continuity. The disruptions had stopped, not because the world had finally granted the philosopher peace, but because the philosopher had finally reached a point where the world's disruptions no longer mattered. The only remaining variable was the work, and the work continued until the biological machinery supporting it could no longer sustain the effort. Al-Juzjani caught what he could. He recognized that the fragments dictated in these final weeks, however minor they might appear in isolation, were the terminal output of a mind that had been producing at an extraordinary rate for over 30 years. Each correction, each clarification, each small refinement was a last adjustment to a structure that would have to stand on its own once its architect was gone. He dictated until he could no longer speak clearly. Al-Juzjani wrote until there was nothing left to write. The canon was finished. The Shifa was as complete as it would ever be. The pen had done everything it could. Now there was only the question of what would survive. The army's route brought them, in the early months of 1037, to Hamadan. It was not a planned return. The campaign's movements were dictated by military logic, the need to consolidate positions, resupply and regroup after the disruptions of the Ghaznavid assault. Hamiran happened to lie along the path, but for Ibn Sina, the arrival carried a weight that no military calculation could account for. This was the city where he had served as vizier and been stripped of the office by hostile soldiers. This was the city where he had hidden in a borrowed room for 40 days, writing philosophy while armed men decided whether to let him live. This was the city from which he had written the secret letters to Isfahan. the letters whose discovery had sent him to the fortress at Fardajan. Hamadan was the place that had treated him worst, and now, by the blind mechanics of a military campaign and a failing body, it was the place where his journey ended. The final days are recorded by al-Juzjani with a precision that honours both the man and the moment. Ibn Sina's condition had deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery. The intestinal disorder had progressed to a stage where his body could no longer absorb adequate nourishment. He was weakening steadily, his physical reserves exhausted by decades of relentless exertion, now compounded by months of illness and the hardships of travel. In his last days, he performed several acts that al-Juzjani presents as deliberate and considered. He undertook ritual repentance, not the desperate bargaining of a frightened man, but the measured spiritual practice of someone putting his affairs in order. He gave away what remained of his personal possessions to those in need, and he freed the servants who had attended him, releasing them from their obligations with a formality that suggested he regarded the act as both a legal and a moral conclusion. These final gestures sit in uneasy tension with the philosophical positions that had made him controversial. The man who had argued that God knows universals rather than particulars, who had treated bodily resurrection as a concession to popular understanding, who had constructed a proof for the divine that operated entirely through logic rather than faith. This man spent his final hours performing the devotional acts of an observant Muslim. Whether this represented a genuine reconciliation of philosophy and faith, or simply the gravitational pull of lifelong habit, or something else entirely, the sources do not say, and al-Juzjani does not speculate. Ibn Sina died in June of 1037. He was approximately 57 years old. He was buried in Hamadan. The grave that received his body was modest, appropriate for a scholar who had died on campaign, far from the city that had been his most productive home. There was no grand mausoleum, no state funeral, no public commemoration proportionate to the scale of what he had produced. He was laid in the ground in the city that had imprisoned him, by companions who understood the magnitude of the loss, but who lacked the resources or the political standing to mark it as the world historical event it was. Al-Juzjani remained to organise what survived. The completed manuscripts, the partial drafts, the notes and fragments that represented the scattered output of a mind that had never stopped producing despite every obstacle the world had placed in its path. The task was enormous. The philosophical system that Ibn Sina had built existed partly in finished texts, partly in drafts of varying completeness, and partly in the memories of students who had attended the nightly dictation sessions. Preserving it would require years of careful editorial work. Distributing it would require networks of copying and correspondence that spanned the Islamic world. The philosopher was buried in Hamadan. His body had finally stopped moving, but his ideas were about to begin the longest journey of all westward, across languages and centuries, into the minds of people who would never know his real name. The journey began in Spain. In the decades following Ibn Sina's death, his major works circulated steadily through the Islamic world, copied by scribes, studied in madrasas, debated in philosophical circles from Isfahan to Cairo. The Canon became a standard reference for practicing physicians across the Abbasid and Fatimid domains. The Shifa found its readers among philosophers and theologians who grappled with the relationship between reason and revelation. Within the civilization that had produced him, Ibn Sina's authority was established quickly and held firmly, but the transmission that would determine his longest-lasting influence took a different path entirely. It ran through a city in central Spain where three civilizations existed in uneasy proximity: Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, and where a small, extraordinary community of scholars had found a shared purpose that transcended the boundaries dividing them. Toledo had been a Muslim city for centuries before its conquest by Christian forces in 1085. When the new rulers took possession, they inherited not just a city but a library, a vast collection of Arabic manuscripts covering philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and the natural sciences. The text represented centuries of Islamic intellectual achievement, much of it built on earlier Greek foundations that had been translated into Arabic during the Great Translation movement of the 9th century. Now, a second translation movement began, this time from Arabic into Latin, the scholarly language of Christian Europe. The work was painstaking. A typical translation involved multiple stages and multiple people. An Arabic-speaking scholar, often Jewish, fluent in both Arabic and the local Romance dialect, would read the Arabic text aloud, rendering it orally into Castilian or another vernacular. A Latin-speaking Christian scholar would then take this oral rendering and compose a formal Latin version. The process was slow, imprecise, and layered with opportunities for distortion. Arabic philosophical vocabulary had been developed over centuries to express concepts that Latin had no ready equivalents for. Translators improvised, coined new terms, borrowed Arabic words directly, or substituted approximate Latin phrases that captured some of the original meaning while losing other dimensions. Among the most prolific and consequential of these translators was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who travelled to Toledo specifically to find Arabic scientific texts. Over a career spanning several decades in the late 12th century, Gerard translated more than 70 works from Arabic into Latin. Among them was the Canon of Medicine. Gerard's Latin canon was not a perfect replica of what Ibn Sina had written. Nuances were flattened. Technical terminology was adapted to fit existing Latin medical vocabulary, which carried different assumptions about the body and its functions. The philosophical underpinnings that Ibn Sina had woven into the medical framework, the connections to Aristotelian natural philosophy, the careful logical scaffolding, were sometimes simplified or obscured, but the architecture of the work survived the crossing. The 5-book structure, the systematic disease classification, the drug testing methodology, the organ-by-organ clinical analysis, these reached Latin readers with enough fidelity to be immediately recognized as superior to anything the European medical tradition had produced on its own. The philosopher's name did not survive intact. Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdallah ibn Sina became, through the grinding phonetic machinery of transliteration, Avicenna. The name stuck. It was shorter, easier for Latin speakers to pronounce, and entirely detached from the Arabic linguistic and cultural context that had given it meaning. Within a generation, European scholars who studied the canon and debated the Shifa referred to their author as Avicenna, with no awareness that they were using a distortion. The man behind the ideas had been given a mask that would eventually be mistaken for his face, and the canon arrived in Europe stripped of its author's identity, his faith, and his world. What remained was the architecture of the ideas themselves, and that architecture proved strong enough to hold the weight of 5 centuries of European medical education. The canon entered European medical education not as a supplement, but as a replacement. By the mid-13th century, it had been adopted as the core curriculum at the University of Montpellier, one of the foremost medical schools in Christendom. Within decades, it held the same position at Bologna, Padua, Paris, and Louvain. Students who arrived at these institutions to study medicine encountered Ibn Sina's system before they encountered anything else. His classification of diseases organized their understanding of pathology. His drug-testing principles shaped their approach to treatment. His insistence that medicine operated according to rational, demonstrable laws gave them a framework for thinking about the body that was more rigorous and more internally consistent than any alternative the European tradition could offer. The dominance was not accidental. Before the canon's arrival, European medical education had been fragmented, a collection of Greek texts in imperfect Latin translation, supplemented by local clinical traditions that varied enormously from one region to another. There was no single organizing framework, no shared vocabulary for discussing disease and treatment that could be applied across different schools and different countries. The canon provided exactly that. Its 5-book structure functioned as a complete curriculum. A student could progress through it sequentially and emerge with a systematic understanding of the entire field. No European text offered anything comparable. The scale of its adoption can be measured in the records of the universities themselves. Lecture schedules from the 13th through the 16th centuries show the canon assigned as required reading year after year, generation after generation. When the printing press arrived in Europe in the mid-15th century, the canon was among the first medical texts to be set in movable type. Between 1470 and 1670, it went through dozens of printed editions, a publishing record that reflected not mere academic tradition, but active, ongoing demand. Physicians who trained under the canon system carried its principles into their clinical practice, transmitting its influence from the lecture hall to the bedside and from there into the broader culture of European medicine. For 600 years after its composition, the canon remained a required text at European medical schools. In no single work of medical literature before or since has held that position for as long. The achievement is difficult to grasp in its full dimensions. 6 centuries is not a period of influence. It is a geological age of intellectual authority. Empires rose and fell within that span. Languages evolved. Entire philosophical systems were constructed, challenged, and abandoned. And through it all, the medical framework that a fugitive scholar had assembled in stolen hours between political crises continued to train the physicians of a civilization that had forgotten where it came from. The decline, when it came, was not a rejection, but an evolution. In 1543, the Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a work based on direct anatomical dissection that corrected numerous errors in the Galenic tradition that the canon had inherited and transmitted. Vesalius did not attack Ibn Sina personally, but his method, cutting into actual bodies rather than reasoning from textual authority, represented a fundamental challenge to the canon's approach. Where Ibn Sina had built his anatomy from the best available descriptions, supplemented by clinical observation and logical inference, Vesalius insisted on primary evidence. The scalpel replaced the syllogism. Over the following century, the canon's authority gradually receded. New anatomical discoveries, new pharmacological methods, and eventually new theories of disease, Harvey's circulation of the blood, the development of microscopy, the slow emergence of germ theory, rendered its specific medical content increasingly obsolete. By the late 17th century, the canon had been retired from most European curricula, replaced by texts grounded in the new experimental science. But there is a crucial irony in this displacement. The method that ultimately superseded the canon, the insistence on empirical testing, on systematic observation, on the logical evaluation of evidence, was the very method the canon itself had championed. European medicine did not reject Ibn Sina's approach. It applied that approach more ruthlessly than he could have imagined, cutting into actual bodies to test what his text had described from theory and observation alone. While the Latin West received Ibn Sina primarily as a physician, the Islamic East knew him first and most consequentially as a philosopher. The canon circulated widely and was used extensively, but it was the Shifa and his shorter philosophical treatises that defined his presence in the intellectual life of the civilization that had produced him. And it was in the reception of these philosophical works that the most significant division in his legacy took shape. The fracture line ran along the boundary that al-Ghazali had drawn. In the Sunni scholarly centres of the central Islamic world, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and the major cities of the Ottoman Empire in later centuries, philosophy as an independent discipline occupied an increasingly constrained space after the 12th century. This did not mean that rational inquiry disappeared. Logic in particular was absorbed into the curriculum of Islamic jurisprudence and theology, where it served as a tool for constructing legal and doctrinal arguments. But the kind of freestanding metaphysical speculation that Ibn Sina had practiced, the attempt to reach conclusions about God, the soul, and the nature of existence through reason alone, without deferring to revealed scripture, became suspect. It was not banned outright in most contexts, but it was hedged, qualified, and subordinated to the authority of theology in ways that would have been alien to Ibn Sina's own practice. In the sheer intellectual world, the trajectory was strikingly different. Iran, which had been the geographical centre of Ibn Sina's career, and where Shia Islam eventually became the dominant tradition, preserved and extended his philosophical legacy with a continuity that had no parallel in the Sunni world. The reasons were partly theological. Shia thought, particularly in its Twelver and Ismaili forms, had always placed a higher value on esoteric knowledge and rational interpretation of sacred texts. Ibn Sina's philosophical method, which treated reason as a legitimate and indeed necessary path to understanding the divine, aligned naturally with these commitments. The result was a philosophical tradition that did not merely preserve Ibn Sina but built upon him. In the 12th century, the Persian philosopher Shahab al-Din Suhrawardi developed what he called the philosophy of illumination, a system that combined Ibn Sina's logical rigour with a mystical epistemology rooted in direct spiritual experience. Suhrawardi acknowledged his debt to Ibn Sina explicitly, treating the older philosopher's work as the foundation upon which his own innovations were constructed. 3 centuries later, Mullah Sadra, widely considered the most important philosopher in the later Islamic tradition, produced a grand synthesis that integrated Ibn Sina's metaphysics, Suhrawardi's illuminationism, and Sufi mystical insights into a unified philosophical system. Sadra's magnum opus, the Asfar, is incomprehensible without the Shifa. Every major argument in it responds to, extends, or transforms a position that Ibn Sina had staked out 600 years earlier. This Eastern philosophical lineage continues into the present. In Iranian universities and seminaries today, Ibn Sina's works remain part of the active curriculum, not as historical artifacts to be studied for their antiquarian interest, but as living texts whose arguments are engaged, debated, and applied to contemporary questions. The Shifa is taught alongside modern philosophy. The necessary existent argument is examined not merely as a historical contribution, but as a proposition that demands a current response, acceptance, refinement, or refutation. The contrast with the Western reception is stark. In European and American universities, Avicenna typically appears as a transitional figure, a conduit through which Greek ideas passed from the ancient world to the medieval Christian one, a link in a chain rather than an independent source. His philosophical contributions are acknowledged but rarely studied in depth outside of specialist departments. The canon is remembered as an important historical text, not a living one. The distance between how his own civilization continues to engage with his thought and how the civilization that borrowed it has moved on from it is one of the most revealing asymmetries in the history of ideas. His philosophy was too powerful to ignore and too dangerous to embrace without qualification. 1,000 years later, the same arguments still provoke the same division, evidence that the questions he asked have never been fully resolved. In the winter of 1256, a young Dominican friar at the University of Paris began composing a work that would become one of the most influential texts in the history of Christian thought. His name was Thomas Aquinas, and his project was among the most ambitious ever undertaken by a European philosopher, a systematic reconciliation of Christian theology with the philosophical tradition inherited from Aristotle. The work that resulted, the Summa Theologica, would define Catholic intellectual life for centuries. Aquinas read Aristotle, but he did not read Aristotle alone. He read Aristotle through the lens of Avicenna, through the Latin translations of the Shifa that had been circulating in European universities for nearly a century. And the influence was not peripheral, it was structural. The most consequential borrowing concerned the existence of God. Aquinas' famous 5 proofs, the 5 ways, as they are known in the philosophical literature, include the argument from contingency, which runs as follows. Everything in the world is contingent, meaning it might or might not exist. Contingent things require a cause. The chain of causes cannot extend infinitely. Therefore there must be a necessary being, one whose existence is not contingent on anything else. And this being is God. The architecture of this argument is Ibn Sina's necessary existent proof, adapted to a Christian theological framework. Aquinas replaced Ibn Sina's emanationist cosmology, in which the world flows from God by logical necessity, with the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, God's free and deliberate act of creating the world from nothing. The theological conclusions were different. The logical skeleton was the same. Aquinas knew where the argument originated. He cited Avicenna by name in numerous passages throughout his works, sometimes approvingly, sometimes critically. But the citations appeared within a vast edifice of Christian philosophical writing, and over the centuries, as Aquinas' own authority grew, the Avicennian foundations were gradually absorbed into what came to be perceived as a purely Western, purely Christian intellectual achievement. The case of René Descartes is more elusive and more contested. In 1641, Descartes published his Meditations on First Philosophy. Yes, a work that opened with a program of radical doubt, the systematic rejection of every belief that could conceivably be false, and arrived at a single irreducible certainty, the fact of his own consciousness. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. From this foundation, Descartes rebuilt his entire philosophical system, including a proof of God's existence based on the concept of a being whose essence includes existence, a necessary being. The structural parallels with Ibn Sina's flying man argument are difficult to ignore. The flying man, suspended in a void with no sensory input, arrives at the certainty of self-awareness through a process that strips away every possible external source of knowledge. Precisely the method Descartes would later call radical doubt, the necessary existent argument, which moves from the contingency of observed things to the logical requirement of a being whose existence is necessary, maps closely onto Descartes' ontological reasoning. The sequence, from doubt to self-awareness to the necessary existence of God, follows the same path in the Meditations that it follows in the Shifa. Did Descartes read Avicenna? The question has occupied scholars for decades. Latin translations of the relevant sections of the Shifa were available in European libraries. Descartes studied at the Jesuit College of La Flèche, where the scholastic curriculum included extensive engagement with medieval philosophical texts, many of which drew heavily on Avicennian sources. The chain of transmission is plausible, but Descartes never cited Ibn Sina. He presented his arguments as original discoveries, products of his own solitary meditation, arrived at through a method he claimed to have invented from scratch. The absence of citation does not prove plagiarism. Ideas travel through intermediaries, through commentaries, through textbooks, through the ambient intellectual atmosphere of institutions that have absorbed foreign ideas so thoroughly that their foreign origin is no longer visible. Descartes may have encountered the arguments indirectly, through layers of scholastic interpretation that had long since detached them from their source, or he may have arrived at structurally similar conclusions independently, a possibility that cannot be ruled out, however improbable the coincidence may seem. What is not in doubt is the result. The ideas survived, the name did not travel with them, and so the man who gave Europe its medical curriculum and supplied foundational arguments to its philosophy became, in the Western canon, a figure mentioned in passing, a historical way station on the road to the thinkers he helped make possible. The grave that received Ibn Sina's body in 1037 was unmarked or modestly marked. The sources are unclear. A scholar who died on military campaign, far from the city of his greatest productivity, was buried with the resources available to his companions at the time. There was no grand ceremony. The state that had sheltered him was itself in disarray, its territories contested, its ruler preoccupied with military recovery. for a period that may have stretched years or decades. The precise location of the grave was known only to those who'd been present at the burial. Over the centuries, as Ibn Sina's reputation grew, the grave became a site of pilgrimage. Local authorities marked it, maintained it, and eventually constructed a more formal structure around it. The tomb passed through successive architectural incarnations as the city of Hamadan changed hands between dynasties: Seljuk, Mongol, Timurid, Safavid, Qajar. Each era left its own mark on the structure, reshaping the memorial according to its own aesthetic and political sensibilities. The current tomb dates from 1952, commissioned by the Iranian government as part of a broader cultural initiative to honour the nation's pre-Islamic and Islamic intellectual heritage. It is a modernist tower, a tall, angular structure clad in stone, rising above a public square in central Hamadan. The design is deliberately contemporary, a conscious departure from the traditional Islamic funerary architecture that might have been expected. The choice was ideological. The tomb was intended to present Ibn Sina not as a medieval saint or a religious figure, but as a scientist and philosopher, a man of reason whose legacy belonged to modernity as much as to the past. The monument has since become a national symbol. Ibn Sina's image has appeared on Iranian currency and postage stamps. The anniversary of his birth is celebrated as National Doctors' Day in Iran. In Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the regions of his actual birth, he is claimed with equal fervour as a national figure, his portrait displayed in government buildings and his name attached to universities, hospitals and public institutions. The contest over his national identity, Persian or Tajik or Uzbek, depending on which modern borders one chooses to impose on a man who lived before any of them existed, reflects the fundamental impossibility of containing his legacy within a single political or cultural framework. There is something irreducibly strange about the tomb in Hamadan. The man it commemorates spent his entire adult life in motion, driven from Bukhara by the collapse of an empire, chased across a desert by the agents of a sultan, expelled from one court and imprisoned by another, forced to disguise himself as a mystic to escape a fortress, and finally carried to his burial site by the movements of a military campaign he was too ill to refuse. He never chose Hamadan. He chose to leave it, repeatedly. The city that imprisoned him, that stripped him of his political office, and that intercepted his private correspondence and locked him in a fortress. This is the city that now holds his bones and claims his memory. The tomb stands in Hamadan, solid and immovable. The ideas it commemorates have no such fixed address. They live in hospital wards and philosophy seminars, in textbooks and debates scattered across the world in a pattern no monument could map. The question posed at the beginning of this story was how a man with no permanent home, no lasting patron, and no institutional protection produced a body of work that outlasted empires. Having followed the full arc of that life, from Bukhara to the grave in Hamadan, the answer is not a single dramatic revelation. It is a pattern, visible only when the entire trajectory is seen at once. Every displacement forced a new synthesis. When the Bukhara library burned, Ibn Sina had already internalized its contents, not as memorized passages, but as structures of thought that could be reconstructed and extended without the original texts. When the vizierate in Hamadan collapsed and the soldiers came for him, he continued writing in hiding, producing work under conditions that would have silenced any scholar dependent on external stability. When he was imprisoned at Fadaja, he composed from memory, demonstrating that the architecture he had been building for decades existed independently of any physical medium. When Isfahan was sacked and his manuscripts were scattered, the Canon and the Shifa survived because copies had already been distributed. The work had outgrown its maker before he was finished making it. The instability was not an obstacle the work overcame. It was the condition under which the work was produced. Each crisis stripped away another layer of external support, and each time the intellectual output continued, adapted, compressed, redirected, but never interrupted. The canon was not written in spite of the chaos. It was written through it, in the margins and the gaps, in the hours between political crises, in the nights after the day's obligations were discharged, in the cells and borrowed rooms and campaign tents where the philosopher found himself, because the world would not let him stay in one place long enough to work in comfort. The result was a body of writing whose most remarkable quality is not its brilliance, though it is brilliant, but its completeness. The canon covers the entirety of medical knowledge as it existed in the 11th century, organized with a logical coherence that made it immediately usable as a teaching framework. The Shifa covers logic, physics, mathematics, and metaphysics with a systematic ambition that had no precedent since Aristotle. Together, they represent the most comprehensive intellectual achievement of the medieval Islamic world, a double monument to the human capacity for ordered thought, produced under conditions of radical disorder. That these works shaped the development of two civilizations, one that knew him as Ibn Sina, another that knew him as Avicenna, is itself a consequence of the systems he built. A collection of scattered insights, however brilliant, would not have survived translation across languages and centuries. A loose assemblage of observations would not have served as the foundation for a medical curriculum. What survived was the architecture, the logical structure, the systematic organization, the methodical progression from principles to applications. Structure is portable in a way that individual facts are not, and Ibn Sina, perhaps because his own life was so radically unstable, built structures of extraordinary durability. The irony that crowns this story is one that Ibn Sina could not have foreseen, and would likely have found both gratifying and bitter. The civilization that benefited most from his medical work, Latin Christendom, received it stripped of his name, his language, and his context. The civilization that preserved his philosophical legacy most faithfully, the Shia intellectual tradition of Iran, inherited only one stream of a thought system that was designed to be universal. No single tradition holds the complete Ibn Sina. Each possesses a fragment, shaped and reshaped by its own needs, its own assumptions, and its own history of engagement and neglect. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to The Long Shadow. We explore the lives that continue shaping the world we live in. And I'm curious, what part of Ibn Sina's story changed how you see him? Let me know in the comments. Today, in European and American universities, Avicenna is a name on a timeline, a historical marker between Aristotle and Aquinas, a step on the road to Descartes. In Iranian universities, Ibn Sina is a living presence, a philosopher whose arguments still demand engagement, a physician whose method still informs practice, a cultural symbol whose meaning is still being contested. In the hospitals of the modern world, the principles he articulated, the systematic testing of drugs, the classification of disease by rational criteria, the treatment of emotional conditions as medical rather than moral phenomena, operate daily, invisibly, and embedded so deeply in the foundations of clinical practice that their origin has been forgotten by the very institutions that depend on them. His name was Abu Ali al-Hussein ibn Abdullah, ibn al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Sina. The world that inherited his ideas called him Avicenna. The distance between those two names is the distance between what he built and what was remembered, a gap that, after 1,000 years, the world is only now beginning to close.